Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Amit Motwani, the Engagement Director here at Bonterra, and Carla Cook, Director of Content Marketing here at Bonterra. So, everyone, grab your water, your tea, your coffee, your lunch, your snacks, and join us for these next couple minutes here for a really interesting presentation and conversation about collective impact. But without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it to you, Carla.
Thank you, Ashley. My name is Carla Cook, and I'm Director of Content Marketing here at Bonterra. I have been here since August of last year, and soon after I started, I was introduced to the concept of collective impact, a fundraising model that I hadn't previously been aware of. It's something that Bonterra believes deeply in, and so I pitched the idea of a white paper to explore it further. And in the course of writing it, I met the brilliant Amit Matwani, who is joining us today. Amit has been with Bonterra for just over a year and is a nonprofit executive leader with 25 years of expertise in strategy, operations, and analytics through the lens of human services. He began his career as a startup team member of CTK, which is the company that created Apricot, one of our products, shepherding rapid US growth and leading UK expansion before transitioning to nonprofits. He has since held key executive leadership roles at medium to large CBOs, including at United Way for Greater Austin, where he advanced data-driven anti-poverty strategies and co-founded Travis County's 2Gen Coalition. Amit is passionate about human rights and universal and equitable access to basic needs and economic opportunity. His belief that individual, family, and community health outcomes are inextricable has propelled his service on several nonprofit and governmental boards. Amit, we are so happy to have you here with us today.
So much, Carla, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And, I just want to shout out and thank Carla Cook here for putting together this excellent white paper that anchors this discussion because collective impact is a topic I really care about. And not just as a framework, but as a practical operating challenge that I've watched organizations wrestle with for years. And so what we're going to cover today is conceptual and it's also concrete. We're going to talk about what collective impact actually is, where it can tend to break down in practice, and importantly to me, what it looks like when the right infrastructure is in place to help it reach its full potential. Something I call collective impact 2.0. My hope is that whether you're newer to the space or if you've been practicing collective impact, which I call CI sometimes, for years, you'll leave with at least one or two ideas that'll sharpen how you think about collaborative work and what it takes to sustain it at scale. And well, before we get into the framework, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the people who taught me what collective impact actually means in practice. In my early days at United Way for Greater Austin, about 10 years ago, I had the privilege of being mentored by Sue Carpenter, the catalytic leader of our Regional Success by Six Coalition. She had brought me on board to run our 2Gen Economic Mobility Coalition. And I remember when she sat me down and explained that collective impact wasn't just a phrase that we threw around at United Way. She actually brought out a worksheet and showed me that it was a codified methodology that was grounded in the work of Kanye and Kramer, whom we'll talk about a little bit later, with real structure and actual requirements. Remarkable colleagues, including Dr. Aletha Houston, Dr. Libby Doggett, both of whom are giants in the early childhood education policy space, and Dr. Chris King, a famed labor economist from the LBJ School and the Ray Marshall Center, as well as the extraordinary nonprofit members of the Regional Success by Six Coalition here in Austin, Travis County, laid the foundation for a movement that has ultimately resulted in Travis County voting to allocate a portion of property tax revenue, creating a $75 million fund supporting access to early childhood education. So, I mentioned that to call out the folks who helped guide me, but also to show that that's what collective impact looks like when it works. That's what's possible, and that's what I want to talk about today.
Excellent. So, to ground our discussion, can you define collective impact for us?
Well, it's a good place to start. We can start with a grounding definition. Collective impact, and as I've mentioned, as John Kanye and Mark Kramer defined it in their seminal work in the Stanford Review, it's built on five conditions. And you'll forgive that I'm dictating the slide, but it's worth mentioning. A common agenda, shared measurement systems, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone support. Those are the five conditions that my mentor showed me a decade ago when she said, we don't just use the words collective impact frivolously. And they're worth knowing because they tell you exactly where collective impact efforts tend to succeed and where they can fail. A common agenda sounds straightforward, but in practice it requires organizations with very different missions to agree not just on goals, but on strategy. A shared measurement is perhaps the most technically demanding condition, and it's the one we'll spend the most time on today. Mutually reinforcing activities mean that each partner is doing differentiated but aligned work, not duplicating and not competing. Continuous communication keeps the network coherent, and backbone support ensures that someone is responsible for the whole, not just the parts. So classic collective impact, which you might hear me referencing again as CI, is built on these five conditions, and it's produced remarkable results, particularly at the community level in bounded geographies and around focused issue areas. In fact, the white paper that Carla put together and published references the Elizabeth River Project and the Greater Cincinnati Strive Partnership as early examples of just how powerful this model can be. But as we'll see in the moment, as we'll see in just a bit, the model has natural limits, and understanding those limits is what leads us to the next generation of CI.
So, as you mentioned, past CI solutions succeeded largely because they were concentrated on single domains and geographically bounded communities. The Elizabeth River project that you mentioned is one of the earliest examples of a collective approach and was focused on restoring one watershed in Virginia. But obviously, today's communities are wrestling with problems that encompass multiple focus areas, governments, and regions. So, my question for you is what is required for a modern CI solution to be successful?
Great question, obviously. And to explore that, let's first begin with where collective impact often starts to break down in practice. And I want to be precise about why, because I think the field, sometimes we oversimplify this in the field. The challenge isn't usually a lack of commitment, obviously, but it's not even a lack of shared goals. The challenge is that every organization is collecting data differently, using different definitions, operating on different timelines, and reporting to different funders with different requirements. And that kind of fragmentation makes it nearly impossible to answer some very basic but critical questions, which is, are we serving the same people? Are we duplicating effort? Which interventions are actually working and where are the gaps? How do you get a continuous holistic view of what's happening? How do you know folks are better off? And the solution that the white paper points to, and the one that we've deeply invested in at Bonterra, is shared data standards. And I want to be careful here because shared data standards is one of those phrases that sounds simple, but it's actually pretty nuanced in practice. So shared data standards, they don't mean just that every organization collects the same data. An employment services provider and an early childhood development program and a basic needs organization, they're doing fundamentally different work. They have different forms, different workflows, different outcome frameworks, and they should. But what shared data standards mean is that across all of that diversity in programming and data collection, there are common core elements that can be agreed upon and structurally aligned. You all will be familiar with things like participant identifiers, demographic fields, income data, participation dates. Those shared elements are what enable aggregation, comparison, and coherent reporting across the network. You don't have to try to harmonize all the data, but if you can find the key core common data elements across all of the participants, you have a pretty good track on getting started with data standards. And that requires more than conceptual agreement, though, and those elements have to be actively mapped and configured in the technology. For example, one organization might use one set of values for ethnicity. I know that many of you have seen this before. Another organization might use a different set of say, pick list responses for ethnicity. Those values have to be mapped to a common standard so that when that data rolls up across the network, it's comparable. That mapping work is unglamorous, but it is the difference between a network that can learn and one that can't. And that's the turning point that the white paper describes, moving from parallel action to coordinated action. And it's only possible when shared data standards are structurally enforced and not just philosophically agreed on.
So can you share some real world examples of this?
Well, yes, in fact, in addition to some of the great examples mentioned in the white paper, there are some just great examples that Bonterra is working with now, examples that I've worked with in the past, some that I've worked with in the past, who are experts at this. Needless to say, United Way is brilliant at collective impact. Now, you're obviously a fundraising juggernaut, but those United Ways that do direct service practice and also that sort of harness direct service provision in their community do an excellent job of channeling, routing, and adding torque into collective impact to see if community indicators are moving. March of Dimes does similar work with their collaborative efforts, particularly in women's health and mental health. For example, in the Houston Harris County area, the March of Dimes has brought together dozens of organizations to rally around improving maternal health indicators in the Harris County region. In Bonterra, we're actually working with a few organizations to achieve the same thing, but more on the collective impact 2.0 level, as I was mentioning. So there's an initiative right now, a national initiative that we're working on that's focused around community-based gun violence reduction. And that's an extremely high potential project where we're seeing the ability to coalesce discrete service efforts at the nonprofit service provider level and coalesce those results not just across jurisdictional regions like cities, but nationally, to be able to see if we're moving the needle on indicators. In addition, some of you all might have heard that we just had an announcement with the Veterans Collaborative. You might have heard this at AWS Imagine, but Bonterra and the Veterans Collaborative are working together on a project called Heads Up Vet, which is looking to reduce the impacts of traumatic brain injury in our veterans population and make sure that folks are diagnosed, treated, and are able to enjoy the highest quality of life that they deserve to. Not just regionally, but again, this is also a national effort. So it's about coalescing the efforts of individual discrete organizations at the regional level in finding a way to bridge and harmonize data standards such that indicators can be reported at a much larger community level. I think those are pretty good examples. We can dig deeper a little bit later if we need to.
Great. So let's get nerdy for a minute and talk about infrastructure. The software required for what you're talking about is it needs flexibility for service delivery, but it also needs the rigor of standardized data. So tell us what an ideal infrastructure looks like.
So I can see you know your way around nonprofit tech asking that kind of question. Totally on point. So it's not just about the tech. It's about the structure and the strategy around it as well. So once your shared data standards are in place, you've got the foundation for something more powerful. A tiered network model that allows collaborative work to function at a scale. Now, the diagram on this slide reflects what emerging CI initiatives are beginning to look like in practice. At the local level, you'll have community-based organizations, the direct service providers who are, on the ground, if you will, closest to those who are being served. They're capturing frontline data, building relationships, delivering interventions. Above them, you'll have the regional leads. They're often public agencies or larger nonprofits. And they're coordinating practice around cities and counties and monitoring outcomes at a broader level. And then, of course, at the top, a national lead or backbone organization provides standardization, stewardship, and the ability to benchmark and aggregate data across the network. Now, I want to be deliberate about how we describe this structure, though, because it's easy to hear tiered and think hierarchy or control, and that's not what this is necessarily. The structure is really about role appropriate visibility. Each tier sees what it needs to act effectively in its role or at its station. A frontline caseworker needs participant level detail. A city agency needs aggregate patterns across providers. A national backbone needs system level trends and benchmarks. The tech has to support all of those views simultaneously without any single tier controlling the others per se. And the white paper makes a point that I think is worth emphasizing. Modern CI depends not on infrastructure and enablement alone, but on the interaction between the two. You can have the best data systems in the world, but if the ecosystem isn't aligned, if the governance isn't clear, if partners don't trust each other, and if implementation support isn't there, the technology won't save you. And conversely, you can have extraordinary community alignment, but without the infrastructure to sustain it, that alignment degrades over time. So both of those things matter, and that's the model that Bonterra builds around. Now, the white paper, in fact, it closes with a line that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. Collective impact models provide the framework, and standardized data provides the engine. And I'd like to unpack what that actually means in practice, because I think it points to something the field is only beginning to grapple with seriously. Traditional CI models emerged when collaborative work was more geographically bounded and more focused within a single domain. The Elizabeth River Project was about one watershed. Strive was about education in one city, and those models worked because the scope was manageable and the measurement was pretty straightforward. But today's challenges don't work that way. Economic mobility, one of the most important outcomes any community can work toward, it's a function of housing stability, early childhood education, workforce development, health, social capital, neighborhood context. Research by economists like Dr. Raj Chetty has shown us clearly that where you grow up, what services surround you, and how those conditions interact over time, those things are what determine whether people have a genuine shot at a better life. It's not about a single intervention to produce that. It requires coordinated, sustained work across multiple domains, which means that measuring whether our collective work is actually succeeding requires something different from what most organizations are used to. It requires not just domain-specific outcome measurement, which every good provider already does within their own programs, but shared cross-domain outcome assessment, a way of asking across the entire network, are the people we're serving better off? Not just better at finding jobs, not just better housed, or just better prepared for kindergarten, but holistically better off across the dimensions that drive long-term stability and mobility. And we could take a look at that in the following slide. You know what that might look like, and it's a really neat depiction of how Bonterra approaches this. It's a significant shift. It's a shift from isolated programs to aligned ecosystems, from anecdotal success to measurable population impact, from philosophical collaboration to operationalized collaboration. And it's exactly the shift that Bonterra's infrastructure, Apricot Networks, and Impact Hub is designed to support. You augment the specialized domain-specific work that providers do brilliantly, and you create the shared layer above it that lets us understand what all of the work is producing together. The future is collaborative, and we believe Bonterra is uniquely positioned to help communities build it. And I'll pause there, Carla, to see if you or anyone.
Yeah, I think a broad question that others might have as well, given your experience in this field and expertise, what do you think the next couple of years holds for collective impact?
Well, I think we're going to see it grow, and it's going to be rocky, I think, for some participants, but we really don't have the choice but to get there to what I call collective impact 2.0. I think we're at a genuine inflection point, and I mean that in a pretty optimistic sense. For most of CI's history, the methodology has been ahead of the infrastructure. The vision of what coordinated multi organization, data driven collaboration could achieve has always been compelling. What's been missing is the operational scaffolding to make it real and go to scale. And I think that that gap is closing and closing faster than most people realize. Those of us here at Bonterra have some pretty close visibility into that. A few things that give me real confidence about the next 2 or 3 years are that first, the data infrastructure is finally maturing. Our ability to standardize, map, and aggregate data across diverse organizations, respecting local autonomy and privacy, it's not theoretical anymore. It's being built and deployed right now. Second, funders are shifting. We're seeing more and more philanthropic and government investment that explicitly requires collaborative cross-organization accountability, rather than sort of single program reporting. And that changes the incentive structure for, the entire field. And, I think this one excites me most, maybe. I think we're on the verge of actually being able to truly measure holistic outcomes at a population level. And this is something that's extremely meaningful to me, having been in the nonprofit health and human services world for the last 30 years. Not just whether the program worked, but whether a person, a family, or a community is actually better off as a result of coordinated investment across multiple domains. When we can answer that question reliably and consistently, I think it changes everything about how resources get allocated. Um, and so, what I hope the next few years bring is a generation of CI initiatives that, they're not just aligning, I guess, around shared goals, but operating as systems where collaboration is embedded in daily workflows, where outcomes are measured across the whole person, where the evidence is actually strong enough to drive real policy and investment decisions, without question. That's the version of collective impact that I think was always possible, and I think we're close enough to build it.
Excellent. So I have one more question I just thought of
Mhm.
actually, then I'll turn it over to Ashley. Is personally speaking, is there a particular issue that you would really like to see collective impact model applied to that you personally would like to see solved?
Well, yes. I mean, economic mobility, I think, is a really big one here. There are so many, that I could drill into, but at the end of the day, it's about families having a shot. It's about families having the ability to move from, say, the bottom quintile of earning capacity to the top quintile of earning capacity. And it may be a surprise to some of us, but I think to many of us, it's an unfortunate truth that we've been familiar with for a long time. But economic mobility in the United States, it's not very high. There's not very high potential for economic mobility. In fact, Dr. Raj Chetty, whom I mentioned earlier, through his work, had determined, I believe that the chance of moving from that bottom quintile to the top quintile in earning capacity, that probability is 7% in our country,
Hmm.
and in some regions of our country, it's even lower than that. And so, places like the UK and Canada, they eclipse that. And, we think, we often think that where we are here in the USA, we all have a chance at the American dream. And though that's the case, it may be a little bit more difficult than we think. And, to another point that was mentioned earlier, our chances at that opportunity are often prescribed, if you will, by where we are born and where we live. and those indicators often play a much larger role. So how do we flip that around and leverage that? So if we know that regionally folks are less probable to be able to thrive, then what we can do is have coordinated interventions at a regional level and actually measure to see if folks are better off in a holistic sense. Right now, if you look at maybe the funding portfolio of a large foundation in your region, and foundations have gotten really good about this, about having strategic plans and impact areas and being very thoughtful about their investment strategies. But if you look at the funding portfolio of a foundation in your region, you'll see very often a broad range of organizations doing a broad range of interventions because the intention of this foundation is to, again, holistically treat the community such that folks can be better off in a well-rounded way. But what are we missing there? You know, each organization is serving individuals in a silo. Do we know who's been? Do we have shared participants? Do we know who's been to 3 or 4 organizations? Do we know what combination of which organizations being visited results in someone being better off? You know, when we say, for example, oh, 400 people received job training in this zip code, what does that mean for that zip code's overall population indicators? Are we going to see that connect to reduced unemployment? Likely not. Likely because the kinds of data we received in these little bitty siloed buckets with each nonprofit service provider that's being funded is not enough to correlate with, oh, wow, the homelessness rate has declined, or the school readiness rate has increased. We can't really usually associate these individual nonprofit service providers with moving the needle globally, or rather communitarily. And what I would like to see is foundations and funders, just investors in general, whether they are, government investors in social impact, philanthropic investors, social impact, or even, typical donors like me who just, want to see the system improve. But what I hope that we will be pushing for, and candidly, what I don't think we have a choice about anymore, given the funding landscape, is how do we know that the participants in a community, that the community members are better off because of the interventions, the social care interventions that are happening in that region, and how can we connect the dots to show that? And something like this, CI 2.0, where organizations who are doing dozens of different types of interventions can still coalesce around shared data standards, so we know who's getting treated, how many hours of service they received, what kinds of services they received, but also there may be shared measurements like shared assessments that transcend and go across all of those domains. And if those things are harmonized into data standards, we can actually see that information across the entire community, and then we can make a case that we're moving the needle on larger population level indicators, and that is the key to turning policy where the real investment can come from.
Oh, I love it. I've worked in technology for a long time, and it's such a breath of fresh air for me to work for a company and work on technology. And I honestly mean this, that at the end of the day, once you finish talking about all the bits and bytes, what you're really talking about is how it's going to change humans' lives for the better. And that just makes me really happy. So thank you, Amit, for that. It was a really heartfelt and good answer. Ashley, I think I'm going to turn it over to you to see if we
Yeah.
had any other questions.
Yeah, of course. Well, Amit, Carla, thank you both so much. I just have to say, I love what you had to say about sometimes the opportunities that we have to reach the American dream are unfortunately predetermined by, like you said, where we live, what our parents are doing for work, things outside of your own personal control. And so it's important to kind of take that into account when we're thinking about how we want to improve like the larger scale or the larger community. So I loved what you had to say about that. And I'm ready. We'll be transitioning over to Q&A here shortly. So folks, feel free to drop some more questions into the Q&A or the chat. We'll spend the next couple minutes here. We have a good amount of time, so feel free to drop in your questions. But while folks are doing that, I did want to go ahead and just launch one more poll here. If you are interested in learning more about Bonterra Apricot and our data standards and how we might be able to help your organization with their collective impact, feel free to fill out this poll that I just launched here. Again, like I mentioned earlier, once we wrap up today's conversation, we'll have one of our colleagues reach out to you to initiate those conversations and maybe answer some of the questions you have. So again, I will leave this up for just a moment here. And then we do have a question around the economist whose work in that economic mobility that you were citing earlier. Raj, do you mind letting me know how to spell that person's name here? Someone's interested in maybe
Yes,
checking them
yes,
out
yes.
later.
What a great question. Dr. Raj Chetty is one of my heroes whom I haven't met yet. His last name is spelled, well, his first name Raj, of course, is R-A-J. His last name is spelled Chetty. That's C-H-E-T-T-Y. And you'll find him. I think the current name of his think tank is called Opportunity Insights. Uh, and yeah, you'll find him there. But it's really really interesting to look at the body of work and how it has evolved over time, and really what Dr. Chetty's motivations are. I'm sure you'll be able to find podcasts or articles about it. But very interesting work, super insightful, and it's while you're at it, I will just recommend drilling down regionally in the U.S. To get a look at the different areas that may have more economic or more or less economic opportunity than others, and what the drivers of that economic opportunity are. I believe in it was 2016, 2017 or so, that at the time he and his research team had found that there were a number of indicators that drove the probability that a family would have economic mobility, and some of those indicators included strong public schools, a strong family unit, if you will, high high diversity in where the individuals are living. So racial and ethnic diversity is an indicator of high probability of economic mobility. I believe there was also uh, yes, low income inequality, meaning wherever the individuals are living, wherever the family might be living, that there be high income diversity. So, not everyone is sort of low income or not everyone is extremely high income, but that there's just a mix of incomes. And that coupled with, I believe the final one or the final big one was social capital, where the key drivers or at least that correlated anyway with the ability to climb economically. I don't know how that has changed potentially more recently, but do let us know if you go into that and research it. Let me know. I could use a fresh up on my research understanding.
Awesome. Thank you. And I went ahead and dropped the full spelling as well as the Opportunities Insights website, responding to that person's question. So, folks, if you are interested in checking that out, feel free to do that. I am going to keep a couple people more seconds here to drop some questions. But, Amit, I actually have a question for you while we wait for maybe some other ones. In this conversation and some of the examples that you mentioned, you brought up large organizations like you said, United Way, March of Dimes, so on and so forth. I'm curious to know for maybe some of the organizations on the line that are, of course, maybe not as big, not as big as United Way or March of Dimes. Is this something collective impact? Is this something that can be done like meaningfully at a smaller scale or with smaller nonprofits in a certain community?
What a great question. Yes, absolutely. And the answer is a little multi-layered. First I'll start by saying that participating with the United Way or a March of Dimes, say where one of those organizations might be a backbone of a coalition. is a great way to be involved because, united, we're nobody is small. And so to be able to participate in that kind of collective impact with a backbone organization means that you're already huge and you're already moving the needle. And the work that you do, is always going to be meaningful, as I think we all know and believe. With that said, this is one of the exciting things about the technology that Bonterra has built is that it democratizes the ability to do collective impact. Any organization that, of course, using the tools that we've developed can have their nonprofit client tracking CRM and in Apricot, if you will, and create their own data standards and invite other organizations to join a network and agree on harmonized data standards to be able to be reported on in an aggregate way. And that's a cool thing. And it's something that I can definitely think of the use cases for that. In fact, I think anybody who's been in nonprofit social service delivery in the last decade recognizes that the pandemic brought situations that we never would have anticipated. And one of those situations that I actually participated, that I actually actively participated in when I was chief operating officer at El Buen Samaritano, which is one of the largest Latin American resource centers here in Central Texas. We actually we received a contract from the city and county to bring together a coalition of organizations to basically take calls from the community who needed help and to do direct cash assistance for individuals who were financially struggling during the pandemic, as well as offer them rental assistance, and then, of course, routing them to other programs. And the value of doing that in a coalition was manifold. Like, first, each organization knows their stakeholders, they know their beneficiary base. And there is a trust that's built between those who receive services and those who deliver services very often. And so what we were able to do is put together a coalition, say with the organization that served the Asian American community here in Central Texas, and with the coalition that was with an organization that was particularly focused on early education, and then another organization that was focused on survivors of domestic abuse. And had the social capital and the trust and confidence to work with them. So what we did was we formed a network, and at the time, the only way we could do this was through the telephony systems, the voice over IP systems that people called into, and so that formed our little de facto network. And we were actually using Apricot at the time, and we tried to squeeze everything into an Apricot, and we did. It was all squozen into an Apricot, but it wasn't, it certainly wasn't as convenient as being able to allow each of the organizations to have their own intake processes and continue their own workflows that their beneficiaries are familiar with. And then report on common data standards. So what we had to do is kind of every organization sacrificed our way of doing business and agreed to do business with a standardized form. And, though that sacrifice, of course, was worth it to serve the 10,000 individuals that we did serve, there are certainly better ways to do it. And, any organization should be able to create a coalition or a collaborative effort whenever it's needed, whenever the community calls for it. And that question warms my heart because it brings me to just a crucial time in the nonprofit social service arena. Thanks for that.
Yeah, no, of course. And I really just wanted to also ground folks here and because like I said, March of Dimes United Way, when you think of that, you can sometimes already feel discouraged as a smaller nonprofit, like, oh, I can't do this. I don't, have that kind of manpower. But I wanted folks on the line to hear that that's not just reserved for, organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars in their budget, but you can really start small. So really wanted to ground folks in that. But thank you, Amit. It looks like we have a couple of other questions coming through. The first one being that since you've talked about like the data standards pretty extensively here today, this person's asking, how do you actually get organizations to agree on them in the first place? If there's, everyone has their own different opinions and different ideas on those standardizations. So yeah, how do you get them to agree with it? How do you like negotiate that? What does that look like?
Yes, well, I would like to say that, well, there's the elephant in the room is funding. And all of us who are professionals in the arena recognize the pragmatic notion that financial sustainability is what drives our ability to be able to live to fight another day and to serve the communities whom we're committed to serve so that we can fulfill our missions. So very typically, the two incentive align the two key areas of incentive alignment are going to be ability to fulfill organizational mission or to advance organizational mission, and the ability to attain funding to sustain that mission. Uh, and so the first, I think, mechanism for even pulling a coalition together is to demonstrate compelling advancement of mission, and also the notion that this extra work that's going to be required is going to be in fact funded. It won't be sort of out of pocket work. So that layer usually I think manages a good portion of the negotiation process, if you will. Now, once we have collective members in the coalition, if you will, that's when the negotiation starts. Once everyone knows that, hey, we're in, that's when folks can start pushing back and say, well, you know what? My process is like this. Why are you making me use this new form? I don't want to do that. Well, that's not going to work for us. Or our folks don't like to hear, for example, that particular term. We don't use that. We don't use that word. We say this other word instead. And so we can't have that as an answer, on our form. Or that assessment, we stopped using that assessment 3 years ago. We used the new version of that assessment. And in fact, our researcher added on a few more questions to that assessment, and that's tied to our funding, so we can't change that. That's when those negotiations happen. And, during the pandemic and the example that I raised, it was kind of a moment and service provider organizations to all kind of work together and suspend the rules for a minute. So if you had an assessment that was tied to funding and you called your funder, they said, "Hey, I've got to use another form because people are suffering," they would be like, "Yeah, I get it. Do what you got to do." In typical conditions, however, that's not such an easy thing to do. So that is where the negotiations kick in. That is where data standards come into play. That's where we say, okay, you collect the data this way. This other core organization collects the data this way. Our collaborative contract says that we need to report the data in this other way that's more in line with our community indicators or with the dashboard, say, of health indicators. Then that is where data standards come into play. How can we map the different responses into a format that is digestible by the investing entity, that is, again, salient for the backbone organization so that they can see the results and information they need to both maintain compliance and operational excellence, and that doesn't change the way that service providers do our business, so that we can continue doing what we know best in the way we know how best to do it. And so when we can just say, okay, I don't use that form, but I would like to take the data, these three fields that we use on that form, and map them over to a data standard that goes into the reporting format that you need, great. And another organization could do the same thing. And so data standards allow us to harmonize key elements of data that can A, either be overarching data that helps demonstrate if folks are better off in a collective sense, um, but B, harmonize very perhaps similar data, but that's just collected slightly different. And so yeah, that's a kind of a conceptual view of what data standards look like. I hope that if anyone's really interested to learn more, that y'all will reach out to us. We'll be happy to tell you more about data standards, and later you'll see my email address at the end of the deck, and so I'll encourage you definitely to reach out to me about that as well.
Yeah, good point. I mean, let me go ahead and put that up there. If folks do want to reach out to you, your contact information is here. But it looks like we have another question here. It might be the last one since I think they've slowed down here. But this person asks, what do you think are the most common mistakes that you see when it comes to backbone organizations? What do you think that those common mistakes are?
Wow. Well, I first want to say that, perhaps this may be a little tacky, but there really aren't mistakes. We learn, and that's because I've been on the service provider and I've been on the backbone side, and I've really seen all of the quote unquote mistakes as learning opportunities that have continued to inform how we evolve. And that is something that the arena does well, is adapt and evolve. So I hesitate to use the term mistake. But with that said, I think can do better, that I've seen is that uh, and I referenced this a bit earlier in the presentation, is that let's say a backbone organization or a foundation or a funder is investing in a bunch of different sort of interventions. Investing in, we want to make sure that communities are better off by means of economic mobility. And to achieve that impact, we are investing in early childhood education. We are investing in employment programs. We are investing in opportunity youth programs for individuals aged 16 to 24 to make sure they get engaged with the education and employment systems. We want to just address the whole spectrum. And in addition to that, we want to make sure that people have transportation to be able to get to their healthcare appointments or their job interviews or their work. And we also want to ensure that folks have access to for them to survive and participate so that they may thrive later as a result of the other interventions. And so what I've seen backbone organizations do is maybe produce a dashboard that says, okay, we've helped 30 children become kindergarten ready this quarter. And so that's what the funder might have on their dashboard. We've invested in our investment has resulted in 30 children being school ready this quarter, and also 17 adults have gotten employment training, with stackable credentials in the medical field, and we've also routed 7 people to housing assistance, and we've made sure that 140 people had access to basic needs like food and transportation. And so that's great and meaningful work, and we all know that. I mean, it's very tough to assign a dollar value to something that's so meaningful to a human being and a family's lives. That said, that's exactly what funding is attaching a dollar value to the services that we provide. So how do those who contribute to foundations, who contribute, how do philanthropists know what the impact of their dollars are? What is their return on investment? We know that folks are better off. And so I know that by donating to this organization that I've done the right thing. I call that half of what is the double bottom line. So doing the right thing is the moral imperative. And then there's the pragmatic imperative. Was there a return on the investment? Is the community better off economically because of that? Is the taxpayer better off economically because of that? And did we do the right thing? And is there a return on investment? Is there a systemic intervention that prevented something from happening again? Or are we effectively just throwing money in disparate buckets and showing that we are doing a lot of things, but we aren't changing anything systemically necessarily? And I feel like that's a holding pattern that a lot of backbone organizations, whether they're foundations, whether they're sort of collaborative, large sort of nonprofit backbones, continue to make or continue to operate in this holding pattern. But I'm really bullish on where we're headed now, as a result of the unfortunate, of course, funding circumstance that's resulted from a lot of health and human service dollars drying up at the federal level. I think that philanthropists, foundations, individual donors are all becoming a little bit more demanding, given that there are less dollars. And so we want to see a little bit more of a compelling and sustainable impact that results from our investment. And so folks are now asking the question, we've delivered all these services, but how do we know if folks are better off from all those services? How do we see that collectively? And so perhaps it's a mistake or a shortcoming that backbone organizations are experiencing now, but I do think that we are evolving out of that by necessity and also by means of sophistication.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amit, this makes me think about another webinar that we did sometime last year with Michelle DiSabato, and she basically talked about what do funders really want and how do you prove that's ROI? Because ultimately, those that are funding as well, they want to see a return on their investment. And so, yeah, this is just a conversation that has been coming up in the last couple months here. And so, really, really love the insight that you provided. And it looks like we have another question here. You had mentioned stackable credentials. Do you mind explaining what that means a little more?
Oh, sure. And I'm not necessarily an expert in this, but when it comes to employment supporting interventions or organizations really enabling folks with education and training and other services to help them attain employment in a sustainable way, stackable credentials are something that come up pretty often. Recently, I think many of us are familiar with the fact that healthcare, that jobs that they're high demand for staff in the healthcare arena, in the green building arena, possibly in the tech arena, and so, or at least in tech manufacturing in certain areas, and stackable credentials are basically credentials that you can work toward incrementally. So say, for example, an individual hasn't graduated from high school. So that individual could be working on their GED sort of incrementally while they're also working a job to earn money. But once they've attained that GED, they can then they can study part-time to perhaps get a CNA or a certified nursing assistant type credential, which is still working towards something else. And then they can continue to work their job, perhaps making more now that they're a CNA, and possibly work to become an MA or an assistant or a medical assistant, or they can work toward their nursing credential. So it's a credential basically that you can achieve incrementally, knowing that the achievement of that credential basically stacks it's a stacking stair step layer toward another credential, so you don't have to stop your life to pursue that very high credential.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. That makes that
Mhm.
clear on my end as well. Awesome. Well, Amit, we don't have any other questions, which I think is also a testament to the great presentation that you and Carla put together. I always say that. Well, folks, thank you so much. Amit, Carla, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your work on this presentation. It was great working with you all on this, and I'm excited that we were able to bring this to life. And then, folks on the line, thank you. Thank you for spending almost just under an hour with us this afternoon. And thank you for your time and your engagement here. This is always makes for a great session when we have some great and insightful questions coming through. So we always really appreciate it. And just as a reminder, everyone, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar again to the email address that you used to register in the next couple of days here. So be on the lookout for that. But with that, I will give everyone the extra time back, the 4 minutes. But again, thank you so much for spending your afternoon join with us. Thank you for engaging with us. Carla, Amit, again, thank you so, so much. And everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your morning or your afternoon again, depending on where you're joining us from. And we hope to see you at our next session. Bye, everyone.
Be here. Bye bye.